Well, good morning and welcome to today's video. My name is Peter Frank and I'm the Senior Manager of Concordia Technology Solutions. Today we're going to be talking about the very fun question of should my church use screens during worship? And this is a rather sensitive issue for some congregations. There's a lot of tradition behind the worship service and the setup of the church, and screens kind of breaks the tradition for many congregations. So it'll be a fun discussion. We've had a lot of great comments on Facebook already. If you have questions or comments that you'd like to share, please go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll address them at the very end. But I think we'll have a good discussion, and I'm very excited to introduce my guest today. He is a friend, former colleague, and now Director of Worship Arts at Cornerstone Lutheran Church in Fishers, Indiana. So welcome, Andrew Osborne. Thank you for joining me today. Uh-oh, we've lost your audio already, Andrew. That's not a good sign. We got your video here. Let's see. Hang on one second. All right, we're going to try to get you back here. Let's see. Sorry, while our team is actively at work trying to bring Andrew's audio back on. We'll be right back. All right, I think we are back up and running. Sorry for that. Andrew, I think we've got you here. We'll switch over to you.
You hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
All right. I can hear you.
All right, good. Well, sorry for the problems right off the bat, but as I was saying, Andrew Osborne is our guest. He is the Director of Worship Arts. Is that correct? Did I get your title right?
That's right.
Good. Now, many of you may be familiar with Andrew. He used to work here at CTS as our content specialist and was the one who really got us up and running with live stream. So the fact that you are in Indiana and not here in St. Louis is probably why we're having audio trouble. So.
I'll do it.
Yeah. How have you been? How are things going there in Indiana for you?
Things are going really well. Just got through the busy season of Lent, and now everybody's out of the office, so it's kind of boring. So I'm home today.
Oh, very good. Well, thanks for joining us. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your role there at Cornerstone and Fishers?
Yeah. So I'm mainly in charge of the contemporary service at our church, but we all kind of work together to collaborate in putting the services together for both services. And as well as being in charge of all the music and things like that, I'm in charge of most of the tech at the site that I'm at. We're a multi-site, so we have other people at our other sites doing some of it. But as far as putting all the slides together and making sure all the audio equipment is working and visual aids are up and running, I'm in charge of all that.
All right, very good. Well, that's really why we asked you to write this post today, because this was right up your wheelhouse. And we're going to start talking about the process at Cornerstone. For how you take bulletins and turn them into presentations. So could you take a few minutes and walk us through your process for getting the print bulletin and taking it all the way to put it up on screens? And we'll start getting into how screens work for other churches. But take us through your process first, Andrew.
Yeah. So we, like I said, we all kind of work together to put our services together. So we'll have like monthly meetings where our pastors and our worship staff meet together and we kind of plan out the flow of the services. And then we each kind of do our individual parts. We use Microsoft Teams where we can add each of our elements to the worship service and then kind of piece it together from there. And then our communications person at our Carmel site, she kind of puts the bulletins together. She's in charge of most of our print that we do at the church. And so she'll design the bulletin and get it all ready, and then she'll send it out to each of us. And then once I receive that from her, I take that Word document and I go through it and make sure I see what we need to put into ProPresenter, which is the program we use to show the screens and create the screens. So I'll go through and I'll create a playlist in ProPresenter using either stuff that's already in there, or I copy and paste the new elements from the bulletin into ProPresenter. And then I go through and design it all and make sure it all looks seamless and not crazy. And that's about it.
Okay, very good. Now, are you using the same presentation at each of your sites?
It's mostly the same. There's some elements that are a little different depending on the site. But for the most part, we're using the same backgrounds and images and mostly the same liturgies. It changes a little between sites.
Okay, very good. So what sounds good about this process is that it's kind of saving work for everybody. Everybody is playing to their strengths. What are some of the other benefits of this process, and what are some of the things that you guys have improved over time? I know you've only been there a few months, but yeah, what are some of the pros and cons of that process?
Yeah. Well, some of the pros are just the collaboration. You get to get other people's input, and like I said, I bounce a lot of ideas off of our traditional worship guys, and they get ideas from me as well. So it's kind of nice hearing their opinion and seeing what they would use, and going through the liturgy together with them and learning from them. So I find that as a huge pro for me. It also, like you said, saves a lot of time. Rather than having one person do all of the services, we each kind of do our own little part, and it saves a lot of work for that one person. So those are some of the pros. Some of the cons, sometimes it can be a little difficult if you want to get ahead on things, because it's kind of stuck at one place. If I don't get the bulletin, I can't start working on the slides. But she can't work on the bulletin until she has all the pieces from the pastors and the worship leaders. So there's always a little bit of lag in trying to get things together, especially if you want to plan ahead a little bit. But that's one of the things we've been working on a lot recently, is trying to get ahead a little bit more.
Sure. You know, we hear that a lot from the churches that we work with, and I've kind of phrased it for myself as communication acquisition, this idea of getting the pieces of information you need before you can move forward with the next step. And we hear about that for bulletins and newsletters and websites and everything. It seems to be a common struggle for those who are working on preparing communications, or in your case, presentations for the church.
Absolutely.
Well, let's move on to the controversial topic for today of, should my church use screens? And not mine personally, but for our viewers, what are some of the potential drawbacks to having screens that we hear frequently, or that you have heard? I know we've had a number of comments on our Facebook page and on our blog post, which we'll look at in a few minutes. But tell me, what do you hear about some of the potential drawbacks of using screens in worship? And then we'll get into the positives.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people that had pretty strong opinions on this topic. A lot of what I've heard is people find that it's the one place they can go to each week where there's no technology. They can kind of get out of the world and just be there without screens bombarding them. Another thing I've heard is that it's not as good as the hymnal. People like having that tactile resource and being able to flip through and see the musical notes and show their kids how to use that. So those are two of the reasons. Also, there's just the tradition of using the hymnal. People really love that tradition. They're great hymnals, so it's hard to move away from something if you're really attached to it.
Yeah, I've also heard that they can be a distraction for some, take attention away from the altar, and if your church has a cross or a crucifix there. Have you seen screens implemented poorly physically, like in terms of their installation, and what are some of the ways that has been done poorly? And I've got a few examples I can point to as well, but I'm curious as to what you've seen.
I haven't been to too many churches where they've actually put the screens front and center in front of the cross, or even gotten rid of the cross. Typically, they tend to be off to the sides so that the people in the pews, it's maybe right in front of them, but the altar's still front and center. I guess I've also seen screens that are too small or too dim. They didn't get good enough bulbs or good enough projectors to actually be able to light them, or there's windows right next to it, washing out what you're supposed to be able to see. So knowing your building and what you need is also kind of a key.
Yeah, I know at our church there in Afton, we've got architecture that was over 100 years old, or at least our church was 100 years old. I don't think our sanctuary's been that is quite as old, but the way we've got it set up, it's really narrow, and so there's not really a place for screens except at the very front, and our crucifix at the front takes up a good portion of it, and so as we've looked at it, because we've talked about having screens, there's just not a place to put it. And I think that's one of the things that you really have to watch out for as you're considering screens is, does it fit in your sanctuary? I mean, is your church designed for that? Any thoughts on that?
Typically older churches, they tend to be the more narrow, and there's not a whole lot of room for them. So I have heard of some churches, especially a little more technologically progressive churches, that they put all their slides online so people can access them on their phones.
Wow.
I've heard that can be pretty distracting for some people, but that's another possibility. One of the churches I've been to was one of the more narrow traditional churches. They had a big, giant altar piece at the front that was beautiful, and they didn't want to have to get rid of that or move that or block that. But they had about 80 inches on each side of it, so they just got big 80-inch screen, flat screen TVs and mounted them next to it. So it was still off to the side, but it kind of filled that space out.
That's really cool. And one of the things my in-laws church did that I thought was just really interesting was they had some wall space, not a lot on each side. It's not a real deep church either. And so they just shine the projector onto the wall. So they didn't even have the investment in screens or the distractions. So if they're not using the projectors, nothing's showing, and so you don't even notice that they could project. So I thought that was a real clever way of handling it, that just worked out well for their space. But yeah, I think you really have to focus on your space too and see, does that actually work. Now, you mentioned this before. I want to dig into this a little bit more. Do you think screens could be too much technology in the church? Like you said, people want to get away from that. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't necessarily follow that argument that well, but I grew up using technology my whole life, so it doesn't feel like something foreign to me. Going to a place where it's completely void of technology does feel foreign to me, and it's more distracting to me, I think. But again, it's up to each person. Some people grew up without any technology, and going to a place where there's technology everywhere may throw them off. So it really comes down to each individual person and how they deal with things. So as a congregation, if you're trying to decide whether or not you're going to bring in this technology, you really need to look at your people and see, are these people going to be able to utilize this technology, or is it going to be a distraction for them?
Sure, and I'm pretty sure, based on what we've seen, that people will be happy to tell you what they feel about that thought.
That's shocking.
I know. Well, let's move on and talk about some of the benefits of bringing screens into worship. What are some of the things that you've seen that have been a benefit of having screens during the worship service?
Yeah. Well, an easy one is I'm a parent of 3 toddlers, and with them being wiggly and trying to get up to the altar and climb up the pastor's leg as he's preaching, it's difficult for me to be able to juggle them and a hymnal and a bulletin. So having the screens with the liturgy on them, I can just glance up and catch back up to where we are. So for me, that's an obvious one. But there's also, I think the church has always been interested in art and beauty, and showing that beauty and of the creation that God has made for us. And so we've always had stained glass windows and beautiful architecture. And I think showing art on the screens and finding artistic ways to share that beauty is also awesome, I think. So there's a lot of ways you can use screens to bring beauty into what you're talking about.
That's awesome. I hadn't thought about that idea of art being part of it. And maybe that's because what I've seen so often is just having the words on the screen, but that does give you that flexibility and having art there in a variety of different ways. And I know it could also be used as a teaching tool during the sermons. If you're talking about a map of the Holy Lands, having the screens there, or if you're talking about geography in the Holy Land, you could use a map of that to really emphasize that point.
Right.
So good. So let's talk about that. Going back to what you mentioned before, hymnals. Is there a place for both hymnals and screens during worship, or is it a either or? Is it one or the other?
I think there's definitely a place for both of them. I know some people really love the hymnal and they know it. They've had it for 10 years now, and other churches have had their hymnals even longer. So having that resource that you're used to can be great for some people. But again, other people maybe aren't as used to the hymnal and aren't as used to looking things up and finding it, but they know how to use a screen because they do it every day. So being able to cater to both of those, I think, is great for churches. And our church right now, we do use both. We have the hymnals available for anyone that would like them, but then we also put the liturgy up the screen so people can see that as well.
So would you say maybe it's a difference of bulletins versus screens as opposed to hymnals as screens? And maybe not even at a church choice, but as an individual's choice. I know that for me, I often, we only have the bulletin, but when I go to my in-laws' church, especially, I'm like you, I've got a couple of toddlers at home. When they were little and I was holding them, it was really hard to hold the baby and the hymnal and the bulletin all at once.
Right.
I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I don't, I still don't think it's one or the other. I think our church, we do use the bulletins as well. So we have the hymnals, the bulletins, and the screens, and really trying to cater to everyone's needs. We don't use the bulletins in our contemporary service, but in our traditional service, we have those. In the contemporary service, it's really all just on the screens. Don't tell anyone, but we don't follow the liturgy exactly in our contemporary service. But we still have the elements up on the screens, and we go through all the key parts of the liturgy.
And I think that may be part of why it is such a sensitive topic, as it goes into that topic of traditional versus contemporary worship, and what that really means. I know we've had that conversation of what is the right phrase. Is contemporary worship really it, or is it contemporary music versus worship? So I think that's screens kind of gets tied to that discussion, which is a discussion that doesn't really relate to technology at all. And that's why as we focus on the screens, I agree with you. I think there's a place for both. So let's go back to that big question. Should my church use screens? I'm not talking about mine, but as our viewers are asking that question of themselves, what would you say is the answer to should my church use screens?
I think the 100% answer is maybe. I don't think there's a set in stone your church needs to or your church should absolutely not. I think for each church, you need to really take time and investigate whether or not it would be helpful for your congregation. I know that everybody hates forming more committees and no one wants more meetings, but it might be a good thing to really sit down and talk about the pros and cons and talk about your people and figure out if they would be beneficial or if they would be a distraction.
Very good. I like that middle of the road answer, but I think that's absolutely right. Is that it?
Very Lutheran.
That's right. It is a both and, yes. But you can't make that call as a blanket statement for any congregation. No, as we've talked, there are pros and cons of each, and depending on your situation, that'll determine it. So let's say, assuming your church decides to adopt screens, and this is really where your blog post that you wrote for us on the Concordia Technology Solutions blog really goes into more detail. But let's talk about the elements of good slides for your congregation and what goes into making that. Because I think everybody can agree that if you are going to have screens, you're going to have slides, you need to do it well. So what makes a good slide deck for a worship service?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's another one of the things that people say is a drawback to having slides is they're usually either poorly designed or the person running them is always a step behind or there's a million things that could go wrong with them. So having them well designed and laid out well, and having continuity between them is really important. So each week I try to make sure that the background I put on isn't too bright, or the words are there's not enough contrast. I try to make sure that you can read everything and it's legible up there. I use the same font every time, and I try to keep it between two sizes. I think it was size 76 and 80, so I don't go between those because those are the most legible. When the pastor is talking, I have his text thinner and italicized, and then when the congregation is supposed to be talking, I have theirs thick, bolded, so there's clear contrast between who is doing what, and I try to make sure that that's always across the board through the whole slide, and it doesn't change from week to week, so that people know what to expect and they can read it legibly. And it's never, I think for me, the most distracting thing is when I go to a service and there's 10 different fonts up there and the colors are like pink and orange background and you can't read any of it. And I find that very distracting. So that, I think people are right. Slides can be distracting if they look like that.
So, yeah, maybe that's the thing, is that we should avoid doing bad slides because that's what the distraction is. But if you can make the slides just a natural part of the service so that they don't call attention to themselves but only complement what's going on, that's a good thing. Any other things that churches should avoid as they are putting slides into worship?
I would avoid having 10 different people put them together each week. I've been doing them on my own so that I know that everything looks the same. And I have one volunteer that I'm working with because he wants to help take some things off my plate, which I greatly appreciate. And so he and I have been working through, this is why we do it this way, and we're kind of pointing out to him these things that we're talking about so that when he does take over eventually, he knows what to do and what not to do to make sure that slides look look good, and they are legible.
All right. Very good. Well, before we get to closing thoughts, I'd like to pull up your blog post on here, just so our viewers can see what we've got on there. In addition to kind of some of the topics that we discussed today, we've got a free download that goes with this. Is an example of what you've done at your church that could kind of work as a template for other congregations. And what it really has in there that I like is that consistency that you're talking about, that nice contrast, the same font throughout the different slides, making sure that when the congregation speaks, it's always very clear compared to when the pastor's speaking. So I appreciate you writing the post and putting together the slide deck for us, Andrew. I think that turned out very well and is a great opportunity for our viewers to go and learn more about this information and get in a template. I'm not sure if we have any questions at this point. It doesn't look like it. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. But Andrew, any closing thoughts for our audience on slides in worship, things to consider, any encouragement for them as they're considering this idea of having screens in their church?
Yeah, I think like we've been saying, it all comes down to context. If your congregation could benefit from using slides, you should investigate it. If you know your people and you know that they would not benefit from them and they'd be distracted by them, then maybe you'd push off on it for now. But always kind of reevaluate what your need is and what your people need.
Very good. Well, Andrew, thanks again. It's always great talking with you. I appreciate you joining us today, and thank you to our viewers.
Glad to be here.
Well, great. Wonderful. Well, have a great rest of the day. Thanks again. Bye.